All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Better Goals for Better Outcomes, Best Practices for Writing Effective, Measurable Goals that Improve Outcomes. My name is Emily Smith and I work with Excelify. If you are not familiar with us, Excelify is a leading provider of special ed management systems. We are committed to supporting school districts and special ed staff in fulfilling the promises made by IDEA to students with disabilities. Our systems streamline every step of the special ed process, including IEP development, service tracking, and Medicaid billing. So that's a little bit about us. And before we get started, I would like to take just a minute to explain a few technical things about the webinar. So during the webinar, you will be able to hear us, but we actually cannot hear you. So if you do have questions, you can actually go ahead and type them into the chat box throughout the webinar. And what I'll be doing throughout the webinar is trying to answer any of the questions I can by chatting back to you. But then if you do have questions for Danielle, our presenter, she will be fielding as many questions as she has time for at the end of the session. So we'll probably have about 10 minutes or so at the end of the session for questions. But we do encourage you, as those questions arise, just type them into that chat box and I'll be collecting them throughout. One of the most popular questions we always get on these webinars is whether or not we will be sending the slides and a recording of the webinar. Yes, we will be sending the slides and we will also be sending a recording. We do ask you to be patient. It will take us a few days to put all of that together. So at the very latest, you can expect that early next week. So within 1 week of the webinar, I'll have something out to you. And then last but not least, if you are on social media, so are we. So you can follow us on social to find out about future webinars, events, news, and contests. And you can tweet about today's webinar using the hashtag SpedChatWeb. So you can see all of our social media information up there. We're on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. And there's that hashtag there. I actually also typed that into the chat box. And then before I introduce Danielle, I did want to take just a moment to have everyone practice using that chat box, just so you know how to use it. So if everyone can just go ahead and type in the chat box and the control panel on their screen where you're calling in from. And that'll give you just a chance to practice and give us an idea of who's actually on the line. So great, thank you. I have already people from all around the country. We have East Coast, West Coast, Midwest. We have Pennsylvania, Washington, a bunch of you from Wisconsin, Maryland, Richmond, Virginia, New Jersey, California. Great, so welcome everyone and thank you so much for taking the time to join. And without further ado, I would now like to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Danielle Damico. Danielle is a customer support and training manager with Excelify. She has an MS in special ed and a PhD in school psychology from the University of Oregon, and she is a nationally certified school psychologist. Dr. Damico's work emphasizes prevention and early intervention for improving academic and social outcomes for students. She has conducted research and provided professional development in the areas of response to intervention, multi-tiered systems of support, evidence-based instructional practices, screening and progress monitoring assessment, and data-based decision-making. Dr. Damico has worked as a research scientist, school psychologist, and an assistant professor in special ed, which included directing an assessment intervention center where she trained and supervised learning consultants and special ed teachers in training to conduct educational evaluations and provide interventions to pre-K through 12 students. Danielle is also an author of Strong Start, a social and emotional learning curriculum. So we are very privileged to have Danielle on the line. Danielle, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you everyone for joining us today. While we get started, I just want to start by providing an agenda for the webinar. We're going to talk about the importance of setting goals and the purpose of setting goals from both research and policy perspectives. We'll talk about a practical process for setting our goals, common pitfalls that we see when we set goals, and move beyond just setting goals to discussing how to monitor student progress toward these goals. Before we really dive in, I wanted to kind of set the stage and get us all thinking about the state of performance of all of our students. We're mainly going to be thinking about goals in terms of IEPs and students with disabilities and students who receive special education services. However, everything that we discussed today is really going to also apply to any student who you might be writing a goal for. It's not just about students who are eligible for special education services. So with that in mind, if we take a look at this graphic, this is a graphic of student performance on the National Assessment of Educational Progress from 2013. It shows both reading and math data for fourth graders and eighth graders, and students with disabilities and students without disabilities. So we can see here that there's quite a large gap between where our students with disabilities perform and where our students without disabilities perform. And that gap is a challenge we need to address, given that not all of our students would be expected to be very far behind academically, and also given the fact that special education was really designed to catch students up to their peers. So this gap is something that we really need to address and take on that challenge. That being said, it's also quite clear from these NAEP data that our students without disabilities really aren't performing as highly as we would expect. The percentages of all of our students who are proficient and advanced are lower, I think, than we would all like them to be. So again, we're really going to focus on our special education students, but be thinking about how setting goals can really lay a foundation of providing effective supports for any student, regardless of whether or not they qualify for services. So what does that have to do with goals? Why are we laying that foundation that way? Goals can really serve as the foundation for the programs that we provide students. They help us determine what level of intensity of support students needs. If we write really high goals, we know we're going to have to create supports and provide supports that are really intensive for students. They also serve as a basis for determining the effectiveness of the supports that we're providing students. So they help us to say if a student is meeting or not meeting that goal, whether or not what we're doing is really meeting the needs of the individual student. So because they set a foundation, it's so critical that we pay very close attention and are very systematic in the way that we set our goals. And this quote here really highlights that we should be concerned as much with how we set our goals as we are about the instructional supports that we provide students. So I'm sure all of you are quite familiar with IDEA and how goals are discussed and described and required within IDEA, but just as a quick review, I've included the sections of IDEA that discuss what should be included in an IEP in terms of goals. And we know that we have to have a statement of the child's present levels, a statement of measurable annual goals. I think it's important to highlight that goals should be geared toward helping students make progress within the general ed curriculum. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means because OSERS has provided some additional guidance on what that should look like. And we also know for students who are taking alternative assessments that we have to have benchmarks or short-term objectives. We also know from IDEA that students' progress toward annual goals has to be monitored and reported on at least annually. And we also know that students' progress toward their goals should be guiding any revision of the IEP as needed. So as I mentioned, the Office of Special Education and Related Services has provided some clarification and guidance on what goals should be and what they should look like. First, that IEP goals should be aligned with the state's academic content standards for the grade in which the child is enrolled. They also should take, again, they emphasize that goals should take into account a child's level of performance, and that they should be designed to enable a child to make progress within the general education curriculum. So lots of attention and emphasis on students making progress within their expected level of curriculum. They also say, however, that alignment with grade level standards shouldn't replace good decision making required to develop an IEP, and that there are cases in which we have to look at whether the child is on track to meet grade level proficiency within the year, and goals may actually have to be written to help close gaps between where a child is now and their expected level of performance. So again, highlighting the need to close gaps, highlighting the need to use data to drive how we set goals. So just as a reminder of what we see in IDEA 2004 and what clarification has been provided, we have to have measurable goals. We should be writing goals that focus on enabling progress for students. They should consider present levels of performance and previous growth and be data-driven, and again, should be focused on closing the gaps. So now that we've kind of talked about what policy says, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about what research has shown the impact that appropriate goals can have on instruction and the impact that appropriate goals can have on student performance, as well as the research on what makes our high quality goals, what makes the most effective goals, and what they should look like. So again, the research has shown pretty clearly that goals serve as the foundation for setting expectations for our students, determining whether our educational programs are meeting student needs, and determining whether we need to make adjustments to programs. So again, the importance of goals can't be overstated. They're helping us set the foundation for what our long-term post-school expectations for students should be and what they are. They dictate the type of supports that we provide for students, and they dictate, in general, what we're expecting to see. So we can't overstate the importance of goals. We also can't just set goals and hope for the best. What research has shown is that goals need to be set and used within a formative evaluation process. So we need to monitor student progress on a regular basis, as opposed to a more summative approach where we're waiting until the end of learning and conducting longer term assessments. So we'll talk a lot more about what that looks like and what goals within such a formative evaluation process would be. Before we do that, though, I really want to highlight how important it is to be thinking about goals, long-term goals, as influencing a formative evaluation process. So if you haven't read this or seen this yet, within the last few years, John Hattie conducted a synthesis of a variety of practices and how they influence student achievement. So he looked at all kinds of different typical educational practices that we engage in and their impact on student achievement, and then rank ordered them to say what is most effective. If you're more interested in learning about this, you can go to visiblelearning.org. The website is there on the slide. But what you'll see here on this infographic is that formative evaluation is one of the top 10 influences on student achievement. And I really want to highlight how important that is, because we're not talking about a particular instructional program or a particular instructional approach. We're talking about the ongoing use of data and the major impact that it can have on student achievement. When educators collect data on an ongoing manner and then use the data to make instructional decisions, we see great improvement in student achievement. So right there it says an effect size of 0.9. If you're not familiar with how to interpret effect sizes, 0.2 is a small effect, 0.5 is a medium effect, and 0.8 would be a large effect. And John Hattie has stated that what we typically see in typical effects of educational programs is about a 0.3. So 0.9 is high. The influence of formative evaluation is great. Now, one of the studies that John Hattie used within his synthesis was conducted by Fuchs and Fuchs. I'm highlighting this particular study because this was really a groundbreaking study in the field of special education and in the use of progress monitoring or formative evaluation data to impact student outcomes. So all the way back in 1986, Fuchs and Fuchs found that when teachers use a formative evaluation process, the reading outcomes of their students are greatly improved over those of teachers who do not use formative process. And that effect size was about a 0.7. In addition to that, though, what they found was that it's not just the process of collecting data. When teachers also have very explicit decision rules to use to guide their evaluation and guide their next steps, that effect size increases to 0.91. So what that means is that when teachers have data, they have very specific requirements for what it means to make progress, what it means to not make progress, and what to do next if students are making progress or aren't making progress. We see great improvement. There's also most of the research that's been conducted on a formative evaluation process, especially within the special education setting, has been conducted using assessments that are members of the curriculum-based measurement family. So further research, being more specific and looking at this particular type of assessment, has shown that educators who measure skills often and use the results to make these changes have students who score higher on other assessments, so those bigger, higher stakes assessments that aren't part of the formative process. And they've also shown that teachers who receive instructional recommendations that are tied to their data teach with more variety in terms of the methods they use and the content that they teach. So from here on out, I'm going to talk a lot about the research using a curriculum-based measurement approach because that is the assessment method, the assessment tool that we know the most about in terms of the research. And the reason that is because they're assessments that are very brief, very efficient to administer. Many of them take anywhere from 1 to 3 minutes. And we know that if we're conducting ongoing assessment in a formative process, which could mean collecting weekly assessment or monthly assessment or every other week assessment, that we want our assessments to be really easy and quick to administer. The other reason that they've been researched so much in this formative evaluation process is because they're highly sensitive to student growth and learning. So we know that when we use these assessments, they will be reflective of the progress that students are making. We wouldn't want to assess with a tool that's not going to show us the growth that students are making. And I will share some resources at the end if you're interested in learning more about curriculum-based measurement. We won't go into too much more about that today, but just wanted to give you an idea of the types of assessments I'm going to be discussing today. There's also a lot of research showing that having high-quality goals is important for students, and when they see their progress toward their goals, their motivation is increased and their achievement is increased. Why would that be? I think we have a lot of hypotheses as to why seeing your progress toward a goal would be so motivating, but it really, what has been stated is that when we know our goals, it helps us direct our attention toward a solution. It's not just toward where we're working, the criteria that we're working toward, but also how to get there. When students see their goals, they're much more likely to spend more time on task and increase their effort, and goals really lead students to take action. So goals aren't helpful just for us as educators as we're providing supports to students. They're also really helpful in increasing the motivation and achievement for students themselves. On that note, another thing that Hattie found in his synthesis of the research was that feedback that we provide to students is really critical and a highly effective practice. So the things that I want to point out here are that feedback is not numbers 1, 5, and 6. Feedback isn't advice, but it's about how we're doing to reaching a goal. And effective feedback occurs during the learning while there's still time to act on it. So again, highlighting how critical it is to set our goals and use a formative assessment process. Number 6 says that most of the feedback that students receive about their work is from other students, and much of that feedback is wrong. So thinking about how we can provide very specific, accurate feedback to our students when we're letting them know about their progress toward their goals. And finally, the last point I really want to highlight here is that they need to know their learning target, or else the feedback is just telling them what to do. So again, just reiterating how important it is to provide very specific feedback to students in the context of targets and goals. So we've kind of discussed big picture why goals are important and how that they can have an impact on the educational supports we provide and our student outcomes. But now let's talk just very briefly about what goals should look like in terms of the research. It's not just any goal that can motivate our students. It's not just any goal that can serve as the foundation for effective instructional supports. Goals should be difficult but attainable, explicit and precise, and observable and measurable. So difficult but attainable is one we're going to dig into quite a bit more, and I'm sure we've all talked about observable and measurable goals before, but we'll revisit those concepts as well. So I'm throwing up the SMART acronym here, not because I think anyone this is any earth-shattering information, but just as a reminder of how we can create goals that are going to be effective for our instruction and for our students. So goals should be specific, measurable, attainable. R often stands for different things depending on where you read the acronym, but relevant, rigorous, realistic, and results focused, and they should be timely and trackable. So we're going to talk now about a process that will get us to those SMART goals. So components of a high quality goal. All goals should have a time frame, the conditions under which we would expect this behavior to be displayed, and a mastery criterion. And in terms of goal setting steps, the way to get to that high quality goal is to determine a student's present level of performance, and as we discussed a little bit earlier, to consider not only present level of performance, but rate of growth you may have seen in the past, to know the time frame for the goal, to determine the conditions under which the desired behavior or desired skill or level of knowledge should be displayed, and to define what it will mean to be acceptable performance, where we want the student to be. So some other research-based considerations when setting the goal. Again, we've likely all talked about observable and measurable goals and having mastery criterion, but some additional things to think about to set a goal that's going to be appropriately ambitious for our students and to really help us set the foundation for the supports we provide and whether or not we need to make changes. So in terms of present levels of performance, to be thinking about what sources of objective data are available. So of course, we will always want to use our professional judgment and our own observations of how students are doing, but do we also have some objective data that will help guide us in terms of where students are now and what type of growth they've been able to make in the past? We also want to think about our desired outcomes in terms of what's realistic, but also ambitious. So oftentimes we maybe tend toward the more realistic side and aren't quite as ambitious as we could be. And along those lines, thinking about what our real outcome is for a student. Are we trying to continue to integrate them within their grade level content and get them to master the same content as their peers? Are we looking at reintegration? And if we're looking at that our final outcome will depend on where the regular class peers will be in a year if we're setting an annual goal. Or are we looking at alternative programming? Do we need to estimate where the student should be after 1 year of instruction because where our outcome isn't going to be mastery of grade level content? Also, there's a large body of research that has explored and documented different methods for setting criteria for acceptable performance. So be asking what sources of data can inform what this criteria should be and what method should I use to set my criteria. So there's a large body of research, lots of writing and training and support that can be provided on these different methods, but very broadly, there are 3 general approaches to use. One is to use benchmarks or research-based criteria for expectations for students. So many of the assessments that we use will have some sort of criteria built in with it that would say a student at a particular grade and time of year should be at this level. Another approach is to use norms, and those norms can be nationwide or local. So you can look at an assessment and how students at the same grade perform on such an assessment in the normative sample and determine where you would like your student to be in relation to how their peers are doing. And again, you can do that at a national level or decide that you want to set a criteria that will put a student at a particular level, say the 50th percentile of the students in your own district. Norms are also available not just for level of performance, but for growth over time, so that you could decide if you want students to be making average growth as compared to their same age peers. The last approach I have written here, student growth percentiles, is probably the newest approach that is being really focused on in the research and practical settings as a very reliable and outcomes-driven approach to setting goals for students. So the work of Benner as well as Roland Good from Dynamic Measurement Group have really been focused on using percentiles to set criteria for acceptable performance for students. So what student growth percentiles do is take a large sample of students that's representative of students in the country and determines what growth you can expect based on where the student starts. So if a student is starting below grade level, you can see what is average growth for those types of students, what's above average, and what's below. So it really helps you to put in context what type of growth can I really expect from my student on this assessment based on where he or she is starting. Like I said, lots of research in this area, and I'd encourage you to look into that more as it's becoming a really great way to make sure we have students that are making meaningful progress within the curriculum. So I've given you some ideas to use for setting goals, and unfortunately there is no magic formula to setting the perfect goal, but hopefully these will give you some context for research and hard criteria that you can use to set your goals. Now we're going to take a look at a few examples of some goals. And this is what goal setting looks like in one of our Excelify systems. So you'll see here we have goals written toward a specific domain and in a priority area. We have some reminders about what should be included in a goal. We have our time frame there. We have our specific goal, and that includes our condition, our observable behavior, and our mastery criterion. So the condition is when given a second grade progress monitoring probe and 1 minute to read. So again, this is one of those CBM or curriculum-based measurement assessments that is brief and efficient to administer. Our observable behavior is Jake will read. He's reading. And our mastery criterion is 90 words correctly. We have there within the system our evaluation plan, who it will be measured by, and how it will be measured. In this case, we've indicated that it will be using informal assessment as well as another checkbox that I can't see on my screen right now, so I apologize. Another example goal is more comprehension focused here. So again, we have our time frame, our condition. When given grade 4 level reading passages, the student will answer factual questions about the reading. That was our behavior with 100% accuracy and 8 out of 10 trials, and our mastery criterion. And we also have our evaluation plan again. Here are some additional goal setting examples in other domains that include our time frame, condition, observable behavior, and mastery criterion. So these goals were set either to the end of the school year or set more as annual goals beyond the current school year. We have a work completion and behavioral goal to start. Jim will complete 90% of his math work with no more than 2 incidences of problem behavior for 1 month. So we can see we don't have to have all of our components in the same order every time. Here we have our observable behavior before our condition. We also have a retelling goal that would be a language or possibly a reading goal. During a retell of grade level text, Debbie will retell the key events of a story in complete sentences in 4 out of 5 trials. And we also have some more functional goals listed there. I want to move on to talking a little bit about common goal setting pitfalls. So common things that we often do in terms of setting our goals that aren't as ideal and aren't going to help put us on track for those high quality goals we want to set. So here we have a variety of goals listed. Some of them are actual examples, and some of them, I'm sure you will say, nobody would actually write this goal. But we can see we do have many of the components of our goal. We have a date, we have a behavior, we have some criterion for acceptable performance. However, oftentimes what we miss is the conditions under which we would expect the student to perform the behavior. We also see goals that aren't super specific, increase reading skills. We don't have a criteria for acceptable performance there either. A lot of times we see accuracy criteria built in, but it's really important to think about what accuracy really means and how often we would expect to see a certain level of accuracy. And it's also really important to think here, are these goals that are going to lead to meaningful outcomes for a student? Are these goals that are ambitious? Are they going to lead to us providing instructional supports that are really going to close the gap for our students? The other thing to consider is, are these goals individualized, or does it look like possibly they were taken and applied to a student and not really tweaked or individualized for that student? So those are some common goal setting pitfalls that we see in IEPs. Oftentimes our goals can be compliance driven. So we're just looking to make sure they have all the components rather than are they really focused on improving student outcomes. And in that way, are they broad and vague? Sometimes they're not very measurable. Sometimes they're overly specific, and oftentimes they're not individualized. So those are some common pitfalls that we see. So we've discussed goals, why they're important, a process for setting goals using data to drive them. So now I want to talk a little bit about monitoring progress towards goals. And I'm sure this is starting to sound a lot like response to intervention or multi-tiered systems of support, if that's something that you're familiar with or something that your school system is working with. And it's very interesting because this formative process started in special education, like I mentioned before. A lot of the early research on using data to inform instruction for students was really started in the special education setting. dating back to Standino in the 70s and 80s at the University of Minnesota. We're very glad to see that these practices have been implemented within the general education setting and become really systematic within an RTI process. Unfortunately, though, we often see that once students receive special education services, the formative assessment and formative evaluation process isn't done as often as it used to be, or as often as it is typically done within an RTI process. So it's really important to think about this ongoing formative process and monitoring of progress within the special education setting as well. So here is our formative evaluation process expanded. So we've talked about setting a goal, and now how do we use that goal to serve as the foundation for evaluating the data that we obtain and using it to make instruction adjustments to our educational programs based on the data. So those additional steps that we've added here are graphing, plotting the data, evaluating the data, and then it must be stated explicitly, not just evaluating the data, but using it to make actual adjustments to the program. So again, we could probably talk days on how to set up an appropriate graph, but I want to highlight that graphs really facilitate the formative assessment, formative evaluation progress. And without a good graph, it's pretty difficult to make timely decisions about student performance. These are some of the key components that you should see on a graph that's really going to facilitate evaluation of progress. The dates, the scores, graphing the baseline data and the goal, having an aim line, and also documenting any changes to instruction that might happen. Here's one example of a graph that you could obtain within the Excelify system. This is a bar graph plotting student occasions of student progress monitoring over time. So you can see along the horizontal axis, we were conducting weekly monitoring with the student, and we have the scores along the vertical axis. The red line is representing the goal of 90, and we can see at a glance on this goal, on this graph, that this student is not meeting their current goal. Here's another type of graph that is commonly used to evaluate student progress in a formative process. This is a line graph. You can see our axes are the same. We have dates and scores along the horizontal and vertical axes. We have our baseline data. That other vertical line there is the indicator that we've made some kind of change to instruction. Our horizontal line at the top is our goal line for the student, and our dashed line is our aim line for the student. We've plotted our data points and connected them and can look at the student's progress in comparison to their aim line. The aim line is drawn from where they started to where we want them to be at a certain time point. So you can see on this graph, we've written the goal out to January rather than an annual goal. So we talked how it's very important to have specific guidelines around the decisions that we make for students. So it's another area of lots of research on what types of decision rules to use when evaluating progress. But one that's widely used and pretty easy to interpret is a 5-point decision rule. So what this 5-point decision rule says is that if 5 consecutive data points are below the aim line, you may need to make a change. And if 5 consecutive data points are above the aim line, you may need to make a change. So this is a simple rule we're going to use to look at some data right now. But again, there are a wide variety of other very explicit and systematic decision rules that you can use to evaluate your student data. A lot of that research is coming from Ted Christ and Roland Good, and those would be things like using trend lines, using slopes, and again, thinking back to the student growth percentiles we talked about before, evaluating student progress in relation to those student growth percentiles. I can't really state enough the importance of having very explicit decision rules. They help us to make equitable decisions for our students, and they help us to make timely decisions that are going to make sure our students have the supports that they need. Okay, so we have a process for evaluating our data, but what types of decisions can we make? We have oftentimes, I think we get frightened a little bit by the idea that, oh my goodness, I need to make a change. But what we'll see and what we're going to discuss right now is that oftentimes the changes that we need to make are just small tweaks to what we're already doing to really enhance what we're doing, not completely substitute what we're doing with something new. So some of the decisions that we could make could be to set a more challenging goal if a student is really making great progress and is well above their aim line or well above the expectations that we have. We could decide to continue the program as is if we're seeing good progress. If those 5 data points are right above the line or hovering around that aim line, we could decide that what we're doing is working. Let's continue going as we are. We could decide that a student is making so much progress, we're going to move on to the next concern that we have for the student. So we could be addressing an early literacy skill in our programming to start with, and we might move on to something more like fluency and comprehension once we see good progress with those early literacy skills. We could also decide a student is doing so well that we'll discontinue support, and we could also decide that something needs to change. That could be changing the entire intervention, the program that we're providing, or it could be just, like I said, increasing or decreasing the intensity of the program. So what does that mean? What does it mean to change the intensity of a program? So I think some of the things we think of very quickly is we could provide supports for more time, more often. We could decrease the group size. Those would all be ways to increase the intensity of the program. But some things that we don't always think about are how can we make tweaks to what we're already doing within the schedule and the group size that we already have that will have a really big impact. Some of those things are to just provide students additional practice within that setting. Are students able to actually do the skill, say the skill, write the skill often within that setting? They should be given multiple opportunities to practice a new skill. And again, feedback is so important. So students shouldn't be just practicing, they should be getting good, solid, positive, and corrective feedback as needed. And those, if we increase those 2 things, that can increase program intensity and have a major impact. The other things to think about are the explicitness and the preciseness of what we're providing. Are we really focusing on the skills that we want students to learn? Are we breaking them down for students? Are we modeling appropriate sub-skills to get the students to the larger skill we're trying to teach? So those are ways that we could really increase a program's intensity, increase its impact based on students' needs, and without overhauling everything that we're doing. So I want to kind of share very quickly how this could look within one student. So again, here's our process. This is Litzy. We start with Litzy's present level of performance. She's a student in 2nd grade. She's mastered early literacy skills, including phonemic awareness and basic phonics. She can segment words set into their phonemes with fluency and accuracy, and she can also sound out CVC, or consonant vowel consonant words, accurately and with automaticity. So her strengths are really in those early literacy skills in the area of reading. However, she's currently reading 40 words per minute with 75% accuracy in grade level material, which puts her at the 20th percentile in her district. So she's reading below research-based expectations because she's reading 40 words per minute, and she's also reading on the low end as compared to other students within her actual setting. She is able to read 1st grade passages successfully, however, at 50 words per minute, and she needs instruction in sounding out words with more advanced phonics skills, reading with automaticity and fluency. And her overall level of comprehension is impacted by these decoding and fluency skills. Something else that we know about Litzy that you don't see here is that last year she also received pretty intensive instructional supports and made progress within her grade level. Based on all of that information and what we know about her present level, her needs, and progress we've seen her make in the past, we're going to write a goal for her, and we're going to use an approach that's using research-based benchmarks. So our goal here is that when she's given a second grade progress monitoring probe and 1 minute to read, she'll read with 90 words with 95% accuracy. So again, this is a criteria. We used a research-based criteria for our criterion for acceptable performance. What research has shown is that when students are reading 90 words per minute by the end of the second grade, they're really on track for success. So that's the goal that we're setting for Litzy. We have her progress monitoring graph here. So we've plotted her data before we started providing support. We drew in our line there to indicate that we are going to provide something different for her. We have our aim line drawn in toward that 90 words per minute goal, and we've started plotting our data. So now it's time to evaluate Litzy's progress. And if we think back to that very explicit and systematic decision rule we have, which is that if 5 points are above the 5 consecutive points are above or below the line, we should make a change. So that very clear and systematic decision rule that we have would tell us that based on the last 5 data points we have here, 3 of them are below the line, while 2 are kind of on the line or hovering right at our aim line. So at this point, we could that we're going to continue doing what we're doing because there is some impact happening and we'd like to see how the intervention is working. Once we collect additional data and see that perhaps Litzy isn't making the progress that we'd like to see, we could decide to increase the intensity of her program. Again, we're collecting data on a weekly basis here, so we can really see how timely our decisions are and that these decisions don't have to be major decisions at the time. We can really focus on tweaking what we're already doing. So again, let's just review that formative evaluation process. We know that setting a goal isn't enough. We need to be monitoring student progress toward that goal in an ongoing way. We need to create goals that are data-driven, based on criterion for acceptable performance that are research-driven and data-driven as well. And in order to make good, timely decisions about our data, graphing is going to facilitate that. And we should have specific rules to help us decide whether or not a student is making progress and what our next steps should be. So some key takeaways. Again, I don't want to understate the fact that goals really serve as a foundation for improving our student outcomes. They help us decide what our expectations are and how we're going to get to those expectations. IDEA provides us some guidance, but they're really minimal requirements, and we should consider our research-based principles for formative assessments that includes goal setting, evaluation of progress, and again, not just evaluating progress, but actually making instructional and program changes based on student data. Our overall goal is really to improve the outcomes of our students and ensure we're closing the gap between where they are now and a realistic but ambitious expectation. On the next slide, I have just some resources. You may have seen them before. The 2 websites, RTI for Success and intensiveintervention.org, are both websites that provide a lot of guidance, not just on RTI, but a formative evaluation process. In fact, the intensive intervention website also includes a review of various assessments that are available and their technical properties and the research that's been conducted on them in terms of their impact on improving instruction for students and improving outcomes for students. The middle is a book on CBM specifically, again, because that is the most well-researched formative assessment tool. And the final page is just references from throughout this presentation. So as Emily has indicated in the chat, we do have time for Q&A.
Great. That was awesome. Thank you, Danielle. Okay, so we do have a couple of questions. So one of the questions you may have just answered, but maybe we can get a more specific answer. What is a good resource to learn more about student growth percentiles and how those can be utilized in goal writing?
Great question. On the reference page, I have two references that are a great start. One is the Benner reference, the first one on the page. The other is the good Powell Smith and Dewey reference. That's about halfway down the page. I would just Google Roland Good and Dynamic Measurement Group, and you'll see lots of information about how he uses student growth percentiles, or what they call pathways of progress, to inform student progress.
Great. And also, just so everyone knows, we will be sending out a copy of the slides, so you'll have this as a reference point too once we do that. Okay, so then I had another question about I guess it's sort of about how specific goals should be. Is there ever a time when you can write a goal that's too specific?
Yes, I think that is one of the common pitfalls that we do see in terms of just practice and what research has called out as a common pitfall. So thinking about something that would be really specific, if we look at, let's go back to Litzy. So she was a student who was okay on her foundational early literacy skills, but was struggling with more advanced decoding and reading with fluency. So a really specific goal for Litzy could be that she was going to read words with the EA vowel combination accurately. That could be really specific. It might be a little bit too specific for her because it's not going to get her to where she really needs to be, which is focusing on reading with fluency and automaticity in order to enable those comprehension skills to take place.
Okay, thank you. And then I think just this is sort of a follow-up, and I think this kind of relates, but this was a question we also had. I think in one of the goals you mentioned, the mastery criteria was basically that the student could read 90 words in a minute, right? When would you advise, I guess, defining whether or not you want to further specify what mastery is? For instance, student will do this over 3 consecutive sessions, over 5 consecutive sessions, and how do you make those kinds of decisions?
That's a great question too. I think it really depends on, of course, the individual student's skills and where they currently are, how consistently they're able to display a specific behavior or skill, but it's also a matter of how important and meaningful is that skill for any student. So for something like reading with accuracy, I want to see that 100% of the time a student can read with fluency and accuracy. So I'm going to be less likely to include, that type of criterion in such a goal.
Okay. Okay, and then any guidance on how frequently you should be adjusting goals?
That's a really good question, and it really depends on the progress that you're seeing for your students, of course. So we write our annual goals and we collect our progress along the way. And if our students aren't making progress or are making great levels of progress, we would likely need to make a team decision about whether or not the goal is what needs to be changed. I would caution, however, that you never consider lowering a goal. We want to set goals that are realistic and ambitious for our students, and if we aren't seeing progress for them, we wouldn't want to lower our expectations. We would instead want to increase the supports that we're providing. But we might, like you're saying, make a decision that we need to increase the goal. So that would have to, we'd have to collect our student data and determine whether or not that was an appropriate next step.
Okay. And then I have a question and I want to answer it, but I'm not sure I totally understand what's asking. So maybe you can help. And Whoever asked the question, if we aren't totally getting it, maybe you can provide further clarification. But here's the question. So let's say the IEP is developed in February, and this is when you develop the goal. And let's use Litsy's example, this person says, and how would you write this goal given the goal start and end date in February 2016 and February 2017, respectively?
I see. Okay, so for Litzy in particular, we used research-based criteria for where a student should be to decide what our criteria for acceptable performance was. So in her case in particular, we were writing a goal toward the end of the school year, and what that research-based criteria has shown is that students should be reading 90 words per minute at the end of second grade. There are also criteria for many assessments that are related to beginning of year performance and middle of year performance as well for a grade. So a decision could be made to write a shorter term goal to the end of the current year. So for Litzy, if she started in February, let's write a second grade goal to the end of second grade. And we could also consider writing a third grade goal in relation to where we expect third graders to be by the end or by the middle of third grade, because it would be February.
Okay, yep, that makes sense. Okay, well, that is all the questions we have. So we're actually going to get everyone out of here a couple minutes early. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining and for your participation. And like I said, you can expect an email from me within a week that will have this recording, a link to this recording, as well as the slides and all of the resources that Danielle included in her presentation. So thank you for joining and have a wonderful rest of your week. And thank you, Danielle.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, bye everyone.